Hi everyone, my name is Kaeli. I'm a senior lecturer to the University of Kent, and I'm the principal investigator of the HRC networking project, Rethinking Fables in the Age of the Global Environmental Crisis, which aims to network all those interested in fables, non-humans, and multi-species storytelling. Our network officially started in June 2023 with the inaugural workshop, New Approaches to the Non-Human Fables. Today and tomorrow, we are hosting our second workshop titled Fabulous Species, Human-Animal Relationships, with several exciting sessions with a stellar lineup of speakers. I have shared the schedule in our chat. Please come along to any of the sessions. And if you are interested in fables and our project, please get in touch with me. As some of you know, leading up to this workshop, we also hosted a series of species-based fable sessions in the autumn of 2023 on horses, canines, rats, and spiders. And I'm delighted to kick off today's session on another fable animal, this time crows. As far as the crow panel goes, I think we have a dream lineup. I am so grateful to today's three speakers for joining us. My special thanks goes to John Wimpenny for co-designing this panel, and thanks also to Thom van Dooren and Kaeli Swift, who kindly responded to our invitation to explore what new crow fables might come out of from their fields of research and their interactions with crows. Lastly, I'm grateful to Matthew Churlew for chairing the panel. Matt is a writer and leader in the field of animalities and environmental humanities, whose recent works include an edited collection, Him, Thinking with Deborah Bird Rose, co-edited with Thom van Dooren, and the speculative fiction anthology Phase Change, Imagining Energy Futures. Matt is also an expert on the recent philosophy of ethology, and therefore is a fantastic person to connect fables and crows in this panel which touches on science, ethology, and multi-species ethnography. On that note, I will pass you over to Matt.
Thanks so much, Corey. People hear me okay? I do apologize. I have a dog who's decided to become very defensive of our territory just right now, sitting right next to me. Welcome everyone to Wisdom of Crows, Fables Science Storytelling, which I'm really excited about, as we have three fantastic speakers who've done really amazing work at the intersection of animal behavior and human knowledge and story. I will introduce them in a second, but I just first wanted to quickly acknowledge the land from on which I work and from where I'm chairing this session. The traditional owners, the Wajak Noongar people, particularly as our local corvids, which everyone calls crows, but which Australian ravens are really significant birds for them, who they know as the Watcher. And I also wanted to acknowledge the great work of my colleague Cass Lynch in the spider panel last time. She's doing a fantastic job of representing her people and the country here that they care for. So what we'll do is have three presentations by our three speakers, followed by some discussion between them before we open up for questions. And if I can just quickly remind people to please keep yourself on mute unless you are speaking. But without anything further from me, I'll just introduce our first speaker, who is Joe Wimpenny, who is a zoologist and science writer from Oxford, who has done a lot of research in crow cognition and in the history of science. And so is a really interdisciplinary thinker and science communicator who has co-authored the book 10,000 Birds, and then more recently her own monograph, Aesop's Animals, The Facts Behind the Fables, which I'm sure everyone here will be ordering right now if they haven't already. and Joe was going to kick us off with a talk on the crow and the pitcher, from how Aesop's fable flew from fiction to fact.
Thanks very much, Matt. And thank you, Kaeli, for making all of this happen and for inviting me to be part of what is such a fascinating and really thought-provoking project. I've kind of been sitting quietly through some of these sessions because, coming from a scientific background, it's really fascinating to me sort of being exposed to these new ideas and these new ways of thinking about things. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to where this project goes next, and grateful to be a part of it alongside Kaeli and Thom. So thank you for inviting me, and also for calling me an expert. I should acknowledge that I don't work with crows at the moment. You know, I did work with crows for my PhD, and I've moved more into writing about science. So my work kind of draws together ideas of the animal-human relationship, and particularly in my book, Aesop's Animals, which the whole starting point for that book was this fable, The Crow and the Pitcher, which kind of combines my interest both in crows and in storytelling and cultural influences on how we think about particular animals. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with this talk. I'll just share my screen. Does that come through? Great. Okay. So how Aesop's fable flew from fiction to fact. So I'm guessing that most people will be familiar with this fable. It is one of the Aesopic fables, probably most well known, but in case you're not, I can run through it really quickly. So essentially a crow was dying of thirst, needed to find water, flew to a pitcher thinking, there would be water in there, it could quench its thirst, but the water level was too low. He tried everything to get his head inside the pitcher and to access the water, but his efforts were in vain. What he then did was to carry stones, as many as he could carry, and drop them into the pitcher, and by doing so was able to raise the level of the water and bring it within reach and save his life. And the moral of this fable, and I'm taking the Townsend version of the Fables here, there are several different versions of the Fables and they have different morals attached to them. The moral of this one is that necessity is the mother of invention. Some of the others, it's more about persistence, little by little does the trick. Or similarly, to do with intelligence, so intelligence trumps force. But they're all kind of to do with problem solving. The question is, what has a fable got to do with science? So that's where this kind of talk is coming from, and that's where I was approaching it. And that's something that this talk is going to aim to answer. So the way that I see it is that there are four kind of aspects where a fable may be impacting on scientific research. Number one, creativity and inspiration. So science is a very objective, it should be a very considered discipline where experiments are based on hypotheses which are generated on ideas about the world around. What a fable can potentially do is to add a little bit of creativity into that hypothesis formation and potentially even into the experimental design. And this is an area where I expect we'll have quite a bit of discussion. Whether fables really have a role in coming up with scientific hypotheses and design. Secondly, fables can be used to broaden the impact of scientific research. So when we come to actually sharing that research with the public, fables can provide that way of actually connecting people with the science. Number three is that they can foster interdisciplinary connections. I mean, we are all here from interdisciplinary backgrounds thinking about fables, but even within the scientific fields, there are people coming at it from different disciplines, maybe child psychology or ecology, or evolutionary biology and cognitive comparative psychology. And finally, that potentially can stimulate discussions around the theory of the scientific fields and the philosophy of science as well. So these are the kind of areas where I feel like fables can interact with scientific research. And when it comes to Aesop's fable, it's actually depicting pretty complex behavior cognitively. So number one, this is a tool, and tool use is a subject that has got a lot of attention scientifically. You know, we're kind of fascinated with tools because they have been so very important to our own evolutionary history. Humans are the masters really of tool use and tool manufacture, and our world has been completely shaped by the ways in which we make and use tools. And the study of tools and other animals is something that has had a lot of research attention. So any kind of idea about an animal that's using a tool will garner that kind of research attention. Number two, dropping the stone into the tube to raise the water level is something that may well suggest a form of causal understanding. And I say suggest, but this is where it comes to hypothesis formation. So it's tempting to look at the fable and to say that it's doing something really clever, but where science is needed is to actually unpick what is going on when the animal does that behavior, and to try and come up with ways of teasing apart alternative explanations. Now, I said it's a tool, and just to be clear on what a tool actually is, it's quite a mouthful of a definition. But a tool basically is using a tool as the external employment of an unattached or manipulable attached environmental object to alter more efficiently the form or the position or the condition of another object, another organism, or the user itself, when the user holds and directly manipulates the tool during or prior to use and is responsible for the proper and effective orientation of the tool. Like I said, it's a bit of a mouthful, but undoubtedly what Aesop's crow is doing is using a tool. It's altering an unattached environmental object, and it's doing that in order to alter the form, the position of the water in order to achieve a goal. And the study of animal tool use, like I said, it's had a lot of attention, and this is a very, very simplistic kind of overview of the animals that use tools. But of course, things started out with our closest relatives, the chimpanzee, so looking at great ape tool use. And really it was since the work of Jane Goodall in the 1960s, where she documented fascinating examples of tool manufacture in those animals, that tool use came to the fore, and people had to realise that, you know, man is not unique for our use of tools. You know, our closest relatives do it. And we now know that, of course, it's not restricted to the great apes, it's not restricted to primates. You can see that this is a capuchin monkey, which is using a rock to crack open nuts. It's not even restricted to mammals. So there are birds that use tools, of course. And for a long time, it was the woodpecker finch, which is this third picture, which was taken as the bird that used tools most regularly. So all members of the species will habitually pick up little cactus spines or little twigs and use them to probe for insect larvae. But at this point, the examples of tool use in birds, and another example would be Egyptian vultures dropping rocks to crack open ostrich eggs. They were taken as being very inflexible, sort of very stereotypic behaviour. The animal just did one thing to achieve one goal. And it wasn't really until the mid-1990s when the New Caledonian crow came into the picture that it was realised that birds were also capable of the kind of flexible and quite general tool use that we see in the primates, and some of which we see in the great apes too. Now, in parallel, there has been lots of research on other aspects of corvid cognition. So the New Caledonian crow, as you can see, is in this bottom left picture. That's the one that's known as the habitual routine sort of tool user and tool maker. And this shows an individual called Betty, who was a member of a captive community, a captive population at Oxford, which is where I did my PhD. I didn't work on this experiment, but I did work with Betty after that. And lots of research has now been done on New Caledonian crows, looking into the way that they use tools, the way that they make them, whether or not they've got any understanding of how their tools interact with the environment around them. So it's all sort of looking at something that we call physical cognition, that's opposed to the social cognition, which is more about relationships between different individuals. And then other members of the corvid family have been tested for other aspects of their behaviour, really. So we know that in Western scrub jays, they have pretty outstanding memory and planning abilities. So they're storers of nuts and seeds. And so a lot of research has been done into the way that they can remember and sort of looking at the limits of their memory abilities. Things like mirror self-recognition have been tested. Social cognition in the way that individuals relate to each other, the way that individuals sort of behave, towards others that they're bonded with. So that's rooks as well. There's jackdaws. The ravens down here have been tested on pretty much everything because they're exceptionally intelligent in both the physical and social domains. They will readily use tools if they're in captivity as well. And then the American crow, and I'm sure Kaeli's going to talk a lot more about the American crow from some of her own research as well. So kind of there's been this upswelling of research into corvid brains and corvid cognition, partly from the sort of tool use that was discovered in the mid-1990s. But like I say, in parallel, people were already looking at scrub jays' memory and planning performance and raven behaviour as well. So it sort of all came together. And the rooks fit into this in that in the mid sort of noughties, PhD student Chris Bird and his supervisor Nathan Emery were developing some new work with these birds. So for anyone that's based in the UK, the rooks are, well, you're probably familiar with what rooks are like. They're sort of crow-sized, but they're very easily distinguishable because they have this bare patch at the base of their beak, whereas crows don't. And they're also a lot more social than crows. So if you drive past a field and it's full of corvids and they're sort of plunging their heads into the earth, getting grubs and things, that's going to be rooks. They're the ones that tend to do that. Crows tend to be a little bit more confined to solitary or potentially being in pairs. But anyway, Chris and Nathan were thinking about potential lines of research and hypotheses for investigating rook behaviour. And Chris had told me that he was looking into the research that had been done with rooks before, and he came across this anecdote really of rooks using some water to plug up a hole and to actually allow water to using paper to plug up a hole and allow water to form, and it triggered this memory of Aesop's fable and the thirsty crow in the picture. So with Nathan, they decided to set up this experiment to actually test Aesop's fable. So this is the apparatus. It's basically just a sheet of perspex. It's got a tube that's sticking up horizontally, and that tube can be filled with water. And then there are some stones hanging around. And so very, very sort of beautifully simple experiment, really. Almost a direct test of Aesop's fable, apart from the fact that the birds could not be absolutely parched. You know, that would not be ethically acceptable within research. So they modified it a little bit. So there was just a little juicy worm which was tacked to a piece of cork and bobbed at the surface of the water. But ultimately, the what needed to be done was the same. They had to drop stones into the water, excuse me, to raise the level. And I'll just show you a video of what happened. So this is the first trial for one of the birds. The video quality isn't amazing. I don't know if that's my computer, but hopefully you'll be able to see what's happening anyway. So it has a little look. I think it can see that there's a tasty treat popping at the surface there. And the experimenter brings in the rocks. Yep, straight in and gets his treat. And so 4 birds were tested, and the results showed that all 4 solved the problem. 2 of them from their very first trial, the other 2 was from their second trial. And they learned to make sensible choices as well. So as well as just the basic problem, the researchers also provided choices between 2 different tubes, one of which was filled with water, one of which was filled with sand. And they asked whether they dropped the stone into the appropriate tube with water. And they didn't do it all initially, but they learned to do that. And they also gave them choice between stones which were quite heavy and stones which were light and so wouldn't displace as much water. And they learned to choose the heavier stones. So Chris and Nathan's conclusion was that the results of these experiments provide the first empirical evidence that a species of corvid is capable of the remarkable problem-solving ability described more than 2,000 years ago by Aesop. What was once thought to be a fictional account of the solution by a bird appears to have been based on a cognitive reality. And this is, I think, where the sort of communication aspect of it comes in, because once this paper was published, it was picked up by media outlets from all over the world. I mean, it was really a huge thing. I mean, I don't know whether people in the audience would remember this. It was 2009. And so many places ran stories on this. And pretty much all of them were framing it around, an Aesop's fable might be true. It's confirming Aesop's fable turns out to be true. It's more than fiction. And I think, it's pretty easy to see why it was such a relatable hook as a science writer. That's what we do. We need to find a way to communicate and to actually help to find a link that resonates with people, with our audience, and that can be challenging in some aspects of science. But for this, it was kind of like a gift, really, that the experiment was already based around this thing that everybody knows about, Aesop's fables, and so extremely popular from a kind of media perspective. And what came next is that lots of scientists paid attention and wanted to test it with other animals. And so, you can think about it as what Chris and Nathan did was lay down a gauntlet in a sense. They said, here we go, we've shown this. We've shown that the rooks can do this. Their experiment didn't have the power to be able to say how they were doing it. That wasn't their intention anyway. It was just to say, look, these are these interesting observations. Now everybody do something with this. And people did. So it was tested in Eurasian jays and New Caledonian crows, of course, because rooks are not natural tool users and New Caledonian crows are. So there was an idea there that potentially the New Caledonian crows might do it differently to the rooks. These are Western scrub jays and grackles also been tested. The azure-winged magpie has been tested, as have Kia. And it's not just birds either. adaptations of this, the Aesop's fable test, as it is now called, have been rolled out to various different species, including several mammals. So this is an orangutan. It's not actually being required to put stones into the water tube. You can't see, it's not great quality picture, but what it's doing is actually spitting water into the tube to raise the water level. So it's kind of looking at a similar ability from a different methodological way. This is an elephant doing something similar, and raccoons as well have been tested on this. And this isn't an exhaustive list at all. There are other animals too. But what you can see is really that the Aesop's fable has been completely integrated now into studies of animal cognition and studies across a broad range of animal species. And, you know, people are working on the experimental design constantly, asking, you know, is this the right way of actually finding evidence for these particular cognitive abilities that we're interested in? So it's been tweaked. I think there are now some studies that call it the improved Aesop's fable test, and different, like I say, different modifications of it to suit particular animals and the way that they interact with the world around them as well. But of course, it's not been without controversy, I would say, and people like Danny Povinelli have been quite critical of the idea of using a fable to structure scientific investigation. And he's called this anthropomorphomania. And from a recent book that he published with folklorist Brendan Barker, they said, from moralizing fables to fantastic folk tales, humans have been telling stories about animals for a very long time. In contrast, scientific studies of the mental lives of animals have professed to be investigating the nature of animal minds slowly, cautiously, objectively, with no room for fanciful tales, fables, or myths. But recently, these folkloric and scientific traditions have merged in an unexpected and shocking way. Scientists have attempted to prove that at least some animal fables are actually true. I went on to say how these scientific studies are doomed to accomplish little more than to mirror anthropomorphic representations of animals in human folklore, and reveal that the problem, this is sort of a description of the book, to reveal that the problem of folkloric projection extends far beyond the Aesop's fable paradigm into every nook and cranny of research on animal cognition. I mean, I think it's healthy to have this kind of debate, and this is an extremely valid perspective. Science is based on objectivity and hypotheses, as I said, generally should be based on having, you know, an idea which isn't just plucked from thin air. And I can see how capitalizing on potentially a fable to stimulate these kind of experiments and gaining all of this kind of media coverage because it's based on a fable is something that might not go down well with everybody. But one of the things that I find really interesting is this analysis by William Hanson, who actually looked into the early tradition of the fable. And what he found is that the earliest mentions of what basically happens in the Crow and the Pitcher fable were never actually written as fables. They are written as observations. So, you know, a crow was seen to be dropping stones into an urn, or, you know, it was a comment within a book, say in Plutarch, where he refers to someone talking about the Libyan crows and how they do this behavior of dropping stones into water urns. And it wasn't actually until the 3rd century that it was first formulated as a fable. So to me, that suggests that actually the early history was based in fact, and that potentially we've almost sort of come full circle now, and that it was based in fact. We've used the fable and now have actually been able to show and support those early observations with scientific evidence. So I won't read that out. I think I'm nearly at time anyway. So just going back to this first kind of slide and the 4 areas where I feel that the fable can intersect with science. Hopefully, I will have shown that each of these is true for Aesop's fable of the crow and the pitcher. You know, inspired a new line of scientific research by generating these new hypotheses and new experimental designs. And it doesn't stand still there. Like I said, it's been taken and it's been improved upon, and it's been the subject of a lot of discussion. But ultimately, that inspiration and creativity did come from the fable. Of course, it's been really important in communication and outreach, both in those kind of initial media reports, which will have gotten the attention of a lot of members of the public. And in my own work, my book, Aesop's Animals, was based on this fable and inspired me to start thinking about how to communicate other aspects of animal behaviour around other fables. Fostering interdisciplinary connections, that's definitely been the case. It's been rolled out over lots of different disciplines and had lots of different people talking about it and critiquing it from different disciplines. And there has been quite a lot of theoretical and philosophical discussion as well around the appropriateness of using fables in scientific research. And I'm looking forward to hearing actually what members of this audience have to say on that too. So I think that's it from me. Bit of a whistle-stop tour of Aesop's fable of the crow and the pitcher, but very happy to have kicked off this session and sort of set the scene for what is to come. So thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jo. We have little emojis showing applause in the absence of the actual sound of it, which is always strange over Zoom, but do recognise that that's happening. So we'll move straight on to our second speaker, Kaeli Swift, who is a behavioural ecologist from the University of Washington, who studied American crows, in particular in relation to their death behaviours in the emerging field of comparative thanatology, which I'm very excited to hear about. And also the host of the amazing Corvid Research blog, which you can find literally at corvidresearch.blog. And Kaeli's talk is titled Crows from Undertaker to Garbage Man and the Real-Time Fable of the Anthropocene.
Thank you, Matt, for that. Oh, is that showing the right thing? Doesn't seem like it. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see the title slide there. Thank you so much for that introduction and for kicking us off, Jo. That was fantastic. I am coming to you all from a slightly different perspective as someone who, as Matt implied, my background is in crow research, specifically as it relates to their behaviors around death. And I've continued on that career as an avian behavioral ecologist. I don't work with currently, but they are something that I still think a lot about. And so it was very fun for me to be invited to this talk, not only because it gives me an excuse to talk about crows, which I love, but also because this question of how does my work relate to fables has stretched my thinking in a way that has been very fun to do. Because one of the things that I grappled with as I prepared for this talk is what a fable is, right? This moralistic tale, versus my experience of crows generally in the context of sort of broader mythology and creation stories and the way that we utilize them in contemporary culture to understand the world or communicate about the world. But the more I thought about that, the more I appreciated that those are all very much related and intertwined ideas, which has brought me then to what I'm going to be discussing today, which is this idea that crows have historically, for tens of thousands of years, sort of been on cleanup duty. And that has taken various forms, from undertaking to sort of the more contemporary version of garbage man, but it has left us with this really interesting question of how humans may choose to exploit that. And it is as if we are living in our own fable right now. So I will be talking about that through the course of this discussion. But first, because it's my whole thing, I got to tell you guys what a crow is. This is the heart of our discussion. What is a crow? The central title of today's talk is all about crows as fables. But of course, as Joe demonstrated, this conversation actually isn't limited to crows. And since this audience may not be birders, I thought maybe it would be helpful to just start with what a crow is. One thing it is not is a raven. So there are about 45 different species of birds in the corvus genus. That includes a variety of species that have either crow or raven in the name. Now, if you want the key details, if you do want to do a little birding homework, I've provided here the comparison between the carrion crow, I was assuming this was a mostly UK-based audience, and the common raven. Some of the ways that you can tell them apart: carrion crows are slightly smaller than ravens. Ravens have these more pronounced throat feathers called hackles. American crows don't have that at all. It's very smooth, but carrion crows have a little bit of texture here. So that can be tricky, especially for Americans looking at pictures of carrion crows. Often get that wrong. But with a little bit of practice, you can tell them apart. And then another key detail for these birds is tail shape. And this is generally most helpful when they are in flight, but sometimes you can tell when they're perched. Ravens have this distinctive wedge-shaped tail versus crows have a square tail. And as I mentioned, when I say crows, I'm not just talking about one species of bird, but dozens of different animals that have this word crow in their name. And that's really important to this discussion, not just because I'm an annoying stickler about getting the names right, but because if not for that, it's really the global distribution of these birds that have provided the background and context for the ways that they have ingratiated and manifested and consumed human culture around the world. So this is one of the most highly distributed groups of songbirds. They are songbirds of any of the birds. And that means that anywhere you go, by and large, there are a couple exceptions, whatever human peoples have dominated that landscape have probably interacted with some species of crow on a regular basis. So like I said, this is an example of some of the crows of the world, but extra points to whoever was paying close enough attention to notice the one bird on here that isn't a crow. So you can go back and watch the recording of this if you really want to figure out which one it is. But where that has left us is this sort of cult of crow a little bit, where we see these incredible storytelling traditions featuring these birds from all over the world. And sometimes those storytelling traditions are so similar that it suggests this sort of ancient story that got passed as humans were moving across the landscape. So here are some examples of the ways that crows and other corvids have manifested them in our mythology and our storytelling traditions. Up here in the corner, we have the Raven and the First Man, which is the Haida storytelling tradition of Greater Raven, found this clamshell full of these small creatures that didn't really want to come out, but with a little bit of coaxing, he got them out of their clamshell and they went on to become the Haida people. Of course, here's Odin with Hugin and Munin, his famous ravens, right? So we see this in Norse mythology. Over here, we have a depiction of Apollo killing Coronis, and that can go into a big thing about Greek mythology, not having to do with crows, but you will see, if you look at this illustration, you see a little crow in the corner. The reason for that is it was a crow that actually delivered this bad news to Apollo, and for that, he was punished and burned, turning from white to black, and that is why crows are black, according to the Greeks. We see the three-legged crow featured pretty widely across various Japanese, Korean, and Chinese storytelling traditions. And then finally over here, we can see that the house crow and the hooded crow both, but primarily the house crow feature very largely in a lot of Indian storytelling. This image depicts crows fighting with owls, because anybody who has who's around crows or their corvids has probably seen that they are often in conflict with whatever your local raptor is. And so those kinds of natural history observations have then been incorporated into these storytelling traditions and these broader sort of mythologies of why these animals maybe don't like each other, beyond just the typical predator-prey relationships. And so where we're going to start is chapter 1, the undertakers. So really trying to understand crows as these sort of agents of death, both in our world and in their own. So humans have appreciated the relationship between crows and other corvids and death for hundreds, if not thousands of years, both in their own right as mourners, meaning people have observed and appreciated that crows seem to pay special attention to their dead in a way that seems unique from a lot of other species of animals, including other species of birds. And at the same time, the way that their relationship with death impacts our own rituals around death and the way that they are sort of present in those moments, and how that has informed our own sort of thinking about their symbology or their role in our own cultures and thinkings about death. So perhaps the oldest reference that at least I know of when it comes to human acknowledgement of crows in death comes from the Quran. So there is a section here, which I will read to you. Thereupon Allah sent forth a raven who began to scratch the earth to show him how he might cover the corpse of his brother. So saying, he cried, "Woe unto me! Was I unable to be even like this raven and find a way to cover the corpse of my brother?" Then he became full of remorse at his Cain and Abel. But here you can see the depiction of ravens as not a sort of negative harbinger of death, but as a guide to understanding how to care for the dead. And that, we can't know for certain based on this passage, but very likely came from the observation of people that these birds tend to their dead in what can sometimes be described as very sort of mournful or curious ways, but the kind of thing that you can imagine would be easily interpreted by a human observer as an acknowledgement of death or as a funeral rite. But the relationship hasn't always been sort of strictly positive or reverential in that way. So here you can see painting has been remaked a couple of times through history, but this is the first one as far as I know, The Triumph of Death, which is as described a rather gruesome scene of all of various manners of sort of human misery and death. And here you can see in this section the inclusion of what we can assume is a crow or some kind of raven along with those skeletons, right? So the position that they have in this painting is not as somebody who's being damaged by this, carnage that you're seeing wrought across this, but rather is there as an observer or even a beneficiary of this misery. And so crows, depending on both where you are in the world and the time period that you're talking about, have come to represent all kinds of things in terms of their relationship with death. And maybe the one that's kind of held the biggest presence in our mind even today is, of course, the masks worn by the plague doctors. So these were utilitarian devices. So they would shove in the nose piece burning aromatics because the smell of dead bodies was so strong. But given that there was an ample source of human corpses around, and you had these people walking around in these sort of raven-like masks, that created this connection between corvids and death and really sort of pivoted them into a more negative light particularly among Europeans, than they had been before. Because, of course, crows had long been connected, even in medieval Europe, with death. There was a myth that if you saw a single crow fly over your home 3 times in a row, you would soon die. But unlike sort of the pivot that they made after this period, that wasn't a bad thing. That was actually a deeply appreciated thing, because it gave the person time to, make good with God and get their affairs in order and so forth. So it was actually seen as a favor. But once there was kind of this mass witnessing of crows consuming corpses, which in European traditions, generally that's not how we like to tend to our dead, that sort of pivoted them into this more negative light. And so then that brings us to today and the way that we depict crows in contemporary pop culture. So you can see here's the villain from Sleeping Beauty, and you can see her pet crow. Of course, Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, which I always like to bring up because Hitchcock deeply appreciated the intelligence of these birds. He had a pet raven, but maybe there's probably no other contemporary pop culture figure that has done as much ongoing harm to these birds as he did, because he created this perception that large groups of these birds is a bad omen and is scary and is unusual. And of course it's not. Crows and ravens both roost communally in very, very large groups. And so it's an ongoing challenge for me sometimes to try and convince people that when they see large groups of birds, that's not because an earthquake is about to come or because there's, some other major disaster pending. It's just a normal part of their behavior. And so, of course, most of that has touched on the fact that crows, pay attention to our dead. But now I want to talk a little bit more about my work and its reflection on the way that crows pay attention to their own dead. So what I mean by that is crows are among a small group of animals that seem to have what I'm going to describe as funerals. And when I use that word, the way I intend it is as a means of communicating that these animals, when they see that a member of their species has died, they recruit other individuals to the area and they gather in those sites. So I'm not prescribing any kind of emotional understanding of that situation, not because there's any evidence that that's not true or that I personally don't believe it's true, but simply because we just don't have the full story to speak to that component of it. So there's still this open question, and there was at the time that I started my PhD, of why do crows gather around their dead? How are we to understand this behavior? And like I said, people have understood and observed this behavior well before I ever started investigating it from an academic perspective. So I want to share a story that is not unique, actually, of somebody who reached out to me in my lab back in 2016. This was after my work had come out, but she wanted to share the story that was a few years old. So this is her photo. And as she described it, I saw a crow approach a dead crow. It brought the dead crow a shiny foil candy wrapper and left it behind the crow's table. It then stood nearby the dead crow while looking at it for about 20 minutes and then flew away. It reminded me of a human viewing at a funeral home. So this story of crows leaving trinkets and objects at the body of their fallen is not unique to this one individual. In fact, when I was in graduate school, I remember I was at the dentist's office and I'm in the dental chair and the hygienist she's getting in there and she's flossing my teeth and asking me what I do. And I was explaining to her and she goes, oh my gosh, when I was a little girl, we lived on a farm and my dad shot a crow. And I watched how they all responded after this and they gathered around, and I swear they got sticks. And they each brought a stick and they put it on this dead crow, and no one's ever believed me. My dad didn't believe me. No one's ever believed me after this. And she was so excited to finally have that sense of validation and recognition that this behavior that she had witnessed as a kid, that there was probably some truth to it. And how much that story has been sort of embellished in the many years since she first, saw it. Who knows? But at the very least, she certainly experienced an organic observation of crows noticing their dead in a way that has then spun into this potentially more embellished or not story of crows kind of engaged in this sort of burial behavior. So the reason that crows make such an interesting model for this question is that when we think about the ways that animals respond to their dead, we can sort of group them into two main groups. So on the one hand, we have the animals that have been systematically studied. And in general, what we see with these is they have very stereotyped, meaning very repeatable behaviors, and there's pretty clear drivers that are responsible for those behaviors. And so the animals that fall in this group are like the eusocial insects, for example. Bees, termites, ants, all of these animals have been studied a lot with respect to the way that they treat corpses. We've done a number of experimental studies on small mammals like mice and rats, and then some birds. On the other hand, we have animals where most of what we understand about their funeral behaviors comes from anecdotal observations. And I don't use anecdotal as a, in any negative way, right? I just mean that it's not based on experimentation, but these anecdotes come from both scientists and, community scientists, and are often very, very good detailed observations of what these animals do. But what we see with these stories is that they are often much more variable. They're doing different things each time. And because of that, ascribing a particular adaptive value to what they're doing becomes much more difficult. So the kinds of animals that fit in that group are generally our large-brained social mammals, so things like elephants, the non-human primates, the cetaceans, so dolphins, orcas, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason that corvids are so valuable is they kind of fit right in the middle of this diagram, where on the one hand, based on the work that you could do to gather up what anecdotal evidence was available at the time that I started my research, it seemed that, yes, there were sometimes these one-off stories about crows bringing Snickers wrappers, but most of the time it had a pretty patterned look to it. So then they kind of fit nicely over here in this more stereotype behavior. But on the other hand, those anecdotes absolutely exist. And if we want to think about a relative brain size perspective, a social evolution perspective, right? Corvids have a lot more in common with these animals than they do with these animals. So they make a really nice model for asking questions about the ways that animals interact with their dead. But that's just much easier logistically to study in something like a smaller bird than in an elephant. So the main questions that I was looking at were things like just quantifying how they respond. So when we describe a crow funeral, what does that actually mean? Trying to understand the adaptive value of their response, what kinds of things they pay attention to, does context matter? And then we did some neural imaging work to look at what mediates their response. So I'm only going to discuss one of those for the purposes of this talk, and that is how and why do they respond? And for that study, we looked at whether or not crows are using dead crows as cues of danger to understand their environment and move around more effectively within that environment. And specifically, what we were looking at is, are they using dead crows as a way to learn about novel predators, so specific people, because we knew before the onset of this study that they're capable of learning and recognizing individual people based on their faces. And then the second part of that was, are they paying attention to the place that these things are happening? And through the course of this experiment, we found that the answer to both of those questions is yes. So if you find a dead crow in your yard and you pick it up in front of, in the presence of other live crows that are there, they're not going to like it very much. And they will learn your face, and they won't let you forget this transgression for a long time. In our study, we only looked at this response for up to 6 weeks, just for logistical reasons, but we know based on the previous facial recognition work that crows can remember people for decades. So there's no reason to think that that couldn't be the case in this situation too. And then likewise, we found that crows were very wary in these areas following these funeral events. So like I said, this shouldn't be taken as evidence that crows don't have a deeper, more emotionally intelligent reason behind these behaviors or interest in their dead. That's simply just not the question that we were asking at the time of this work. But what we can say is they are, at the very least, using dead crows as a means to learn about danger. And so this study, I won't say that it met quite the threshold of the Aesop's news articles, but certainly got picked up and sort of passed around. And so you would see these headlines about crows learning lessons from death and why they hold these funerals. And then that kind of spun off into popular culture, into these sort of memes that you can still see floating around the internet today about crow funerals and their functions, and are they actually, CSI or conducting murder investigations or whatever it is. But this work has sort of become its own thing on the internet, and the way that people have connected with it and sort of made their own stories and jokes about the significance of this behavior, I think is really unique among a lot of animals, and sort of speaks to the ways that humans really sort of hold tight to crows and the ways that we like to discuss them and share about them. So next, I just want to talk about how crows have sort of pivoted from this undertaking behavior more into the place that I think that they hold in more contemporary culture of being garbage men. So if crows aren't out, if we don't have dead bodies everywhere, crows aren't out just consuming people, why do crows continue to be such a uniting cultural force like they were, back in the medieval age? And you need only search for crow meme to really see evidence of just how impactful they are. This returns over 17 million results. And of course, not all of them are about crows, but this kind of stuff is everywhere. And it's everywhere in a way that most other birds, can only dream of. So some examples of why I think that crows are so ingratiated into our culture. You may have heard the story a few years ago out of Oregon of a crow that had been trained to talk. Joe mentioned Pliny. I always like to remind people it was him that we can thank for the myth that you have to split a crow's tongue in order for it to be able to talk like a person. That's not true. You can train them. They're just like parrots. So this crow knew a couple cuss words, found its way into an elementary school, much to the delight of the children there, before being returned to its keeper. There's a very famous internet story of somebody who created an armed army of crows, and they were seeking legal advice because they were a little bit worried that their neighbors might try and go after them. There are stories of crows leaving gifts that are incredibly popular. Here's one of somebody who said not only did they leave gifts, but they actually left art where they had strung these pop can pull tabs onto little Douglas fir twigs. And we can really thank their natural history for this relationship that they have with us, right? So many species of crows, not all of them, of course, but many of them are what we would call a synanthropic species. It's not that they've learned to adapt in the Anthropocene, they really thrive in it. They thrive alongside us. And some of these species really can't be found more than 20 or so kilometers away from a human settlement. They are in many ways very dependent on us for their existence. And there are some other features of their natural history that provide for this. They're very generalist nesters, so they can nest in a variety of places. They have a pretty wide thermal range. And then last but not least, they have a very generalist diet. So our initial encounters with them may have come from their keenness to steal food from us or share food from us. But now we see it more manifesting as their desire to exploit human refuse, which we provide in abundance. And so I'll finish with chapter 3, which is the real-time fable of the crow in the Anthropocene. So crows, at least some crows, right, are among the few wild animals that have been able to really successfully exploit us. Humans spend most of our time finding every possible means of exploiting every natural resource in the world. When I say humans, I should caveat that by saying some people. But in our sort of capitalist communities that we live in, right, the whole goal is to try and exploit every natural resource to within an inch of its life. And most of the world's animals, as we're seeing in this era of climate change, will probably suffer from that. But crows, at least until this point, and until the mosquitoes in West Nile maybe tip the scales for them, crows have done really well in this situation. They're very good at exploiting us. And classic sort of human behavior, rather than just leaving them to do their thing, some people have wanted to see how they could maybe exploit even the crow. And so what this has given rise to is what I call the butts for nuts phenomenon, where starting in about 2008, if you're familiar with Joshua Klein's TED Talk, where he described the crow vending machine, startups and people every 5 or 10 years or so have tried to figure out ways to harness the power of crows to pick up garbage, and basically trying to invent contraptions that would train wild crows to pick up the garbage that people seem incapable of doing on their own. And like I said, these have come about every couple of years. They represent a substantial financial investment from the startups that are pursuing these questions, and they have never worked because crows, at the end of the day, while captive crows very readily can learn these behaviors. Like Joe was saying, there's no reason cognitively they can't. When you lose the leverage of captivity, it's very difficult to get crows in mass and in perpetuity to engage in these behaviors. But it stems this question that I think is so interesting of here we have this species, right, ourselves, living in this incredibly consumptive, incredibly waste-producing life. And rather than training ourselves to just clean up better and be more, engage in more conservation, we are trying to exploit sort of the one animal that seems to be thriving alongside of us to pick up after our garbage. And I will hand it to the example that came out of France. So when they engaged in this, they were doing it strictly for the purposes of sort of a publicity stunt to ask this question: if crows can pick up our trash, why can't you? But it begs some really interesting questions and lessons about what it means to live in a world where we're producing so much waste and consuming so much, and whose job is it really to make that better? So with that, I think I've gone a little bit over time. I'll turn the table. Thank you all so much for your time tonight.
Thanks so much, Kaeli. That's great. And it's nice to see people not only sharing in the knowledge that people bring to them about crows, but also using it to tell our own fables in different ways as well. So we will move straight to our third speaker before some discussion. Thom van Dooren, who is a Professor of Environmental Humanities at the University of Sydney, where he also is Deputy Director of the Sydney Environment Institute. I'm sure you all know Tom's world-leading work in environmental humanities and extinction studies, including his books Flightways, The World in a Shell, and between those two, of course, The Wake of Crows. And Tom's talk today is titled Exploring the Border Between Ethics and Ethology with Crows.
Thanks very much, Matt, and thanks very much, Kaeli, for having us and for organising this. And it's a real pleasure to be speaking on this panel and speaking with Kaeli and Joe. So thanks. So I'll just jump in, and I've written because that's how I like to share things, so I can stay on time. So before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that I'm zooming in from the lands of the Gundungurra and Darug people in the Blue Mountains in Australia, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I want to start with a crow story. It's a fable of sorts. It's also a piece of speculative ethology. So my aim is not to offer a traditional fable, at least as I understand the genre, but to offer an example of a mode of thinking and writing that I've aimed to develop in my work in recent years. So this work brings the biological sciences into conversation with philosophy, and specifically it draws on research on the cognitive and emotional lives of animals, in this case corvids, to open up questions of what we might think of as earthly cohabitation. So asking how this knowledge about animal lives might pull us into new forms of responsibility with and for others. So on the surface, I think this mode of thinking has some important similarities with the traditional fables. And I thank Kaeli for opening up those questions, because I actually hadn't given fables a lot of thought until that prompt. So this is very much thinking in process. So an important similarity, I think, between the work I'm trying to do and more traditional fables like Aesop are the way in which those fables take the biological details of animals' lives, more or less accurately, and extrapolate from them, more or less reasonably, to present moral lessons. But the move between ethology and ethics that I'm proposing in my work, I think, is a bit different. It's much more tentative. I hope it's more carefully speculative. And at the same time, it's much less expansive, refusing the kind of generalization in which any given animal might become a universal guide for the conduct of others. So my thoughts here are very much in their early stages. I can't claim to know much about fables beyond what I've learned from my own readings. And so I look forward to thinking with you all about how the kinds of stories I'm trying to tell might align with and depart from the fable as it's understood by all of you. So I'll return to those points at the end, but I want to come back to the corvid story that I mentioned. So this story takes place in a place we've already been introduced to by Joe, in Mattingley in Cambridgeshire. And it's in an aviary that's home to birds of a variety of species within the larger family Corvidae. And over the years, under the direction of Nicola Clayton, these birds have taken part in numerous experiments that have added significantly to the scientific understanding of the cognitive, emotional, and social lives of corvids. So the particular studies I want to focus on, though, involve Western scrub jays and Eurasian jays, members of the larger family Corvidae and close relatives of what I will refer to as the true crows, the species of the genus Corvus. So at the core of these experiments, there was an effort to explore whether and how these two different types of jays might imagine, anticipate, and prepare for the future. That is, their capacity for prospective cognition. So in what was perhaps the first key study, C.R. Raby, Clayton, and colleagues worked with Western scrub jays. And this study took advantage of the common behaviour amongst jays and other corvids of caching or hiding away little bits of food or something else, often food, to collect and consume in the future. So the caching of food and other items is itself a fascinating behaviour, one that's relatively widespread among mammals and birds, but it's one that corvids seem to have a particular talent for. When it comes to research on prospective cognition, caching has been a behaviour of particular interest to some scientists. As Nikki Clayton explained to me in an interview, this is because caching lends itself so well to experimental inquiry. Of course, birds do many things that seem to be future-oriented, but not all such behaviours lend themselves to the kind of experimental inquiry that really opens up the underlying cognitive capacities of those behaviours. As Jo has put it in her discussion of corvid behaviour, as with all topics in cognition research, the question of can an animal do something is straightforward to answer. The much thornier question is how. So take, for example, the behaviour of nest construction. It certainly looks future-oriented. Why else would a bird go to the bother of making a nest, if not with the idea of eventually laying eggs in it? But for behavioural biologists, these kinds of activities might just as easily be the result of something like a fixed action pattern that's triggered by hormones or changing temperatures or light. In short, the bird may have no clear sense of why she's doing what she's doing. She may know how to build a nest. She may even be able to modify that nest to better suit local conditions. But does this mean that she knows it will one day become a home to eggs and chicks? With this in mind, biologists tend to distinguish between behaviours that are grounded in a sense of the future and those that, while seemingly future-oriented, are not. So all of this is to say that while it may be the case that in building their nests, birds are relying on sophisticated memories of the past and imagined future scenarios, it's very hard to test this experimentally. But when corvids hide food items, and again when they return to collect them or to move or check on them, researchers can explore the extent to which they understand their actions in any given present as either making possible future activities or as enabled by those of the past. As with so many biological debates about animals, these discussions of the future take place within the context of a long history of assuming that most animals have very little going on upstairs. Perhaps most important in this context is the Bischoff-Kohler hypothesis, which proposes that animals other than humans cannot anticipate future need or drive states and are therefore bound to a present state that is defined by their current motivational state. In line with a long and rich tradition of anthropocentric propers, that is, capacities imagined to be uniquely and perhaps definitively human, from this perspective, other animals are trapped in their present reality, unable to imagine or take action to influence a future need or desire. So I hope you'll forgive what's now become a very long preamble to the promised corvid story. However, I think that context is really essential to understanding the activities of these scientists and their birds and why they matter. So in brief, the experiment took place as follows. A group of jays were familiarised with two different rooms that they might be allowed access to each morning. In one room, they were given breakfast, but in the other room, they'd go hungry. Later in the day, the birds were provided with access to food and to both of these rooms. The birds preferentially cached food in the room where they'd been left hungry, rather than the room where they were fed. So to avoid the possibility that that caching was unthinkingly triggered in a particular room because of a past association with hunger, rather than the anticipation of possible future hunger, a second experiment was then run. The same general structure was adopted. However, instead of only being fed in one room, birds were now fed in both rooms, but they were provided with a different food in each of the rooms, dog kibble in one and peanuts in the other. In the afternoon, they were again provided access to both rooms and to food. If the caching was determined by the fact that the birds associated a particular room with a particular food, one would expect them to cache the food that's usually found in that room in the same room. Instead, demonstrating their desire for dietary diversity, it's thought, the birds tended to cache the opposite foods, ensuring that they would have access to both the following morning. As the study's authors note, this experiment shows that these birds must have the capability to plan for a future motivational state, in contrast to simply acting on the current one, over a timescale stretching at least into tomorrow. These results, therefore, challenge the assumption that the ability to anticipate and take action for future needs evolved only in the hominid lineage. So around the same time that that study was taking place, or those studies, another important experiment was happening in the same lab, led by Sergio Correa. This study took advantage of an established understanding that birds and other animals that are fed only a particular food become specifically sated. That is, they no longer desire any more of that particular food. In this study, jays were fed a particular food until sated and then allowed to cache two different kinds of food. The jays were not able to access their caches, though, until the next morning, when they would have just been fed the second type of food that they now had access to for breakfast. So the question was whether they would cache the food that they currently preferred, or the one that they were currently not interested in but knew that they would prefer at the point in the future when they would actually be recovering and eating the caches. So they tended to do the latter. In this study too, then, the results showed that, as the researchers put it, contrary to the Bischoff-Kohler hypothesis, scrub jays are not bound to their present motivational state. The birds can anticipate and take appropriate action towards the satisfaction of a future need, one that is not currently experienced. So other studies have added even more richness to this work on prospective cognition, exploring the ways in which corvids carefully avoid being seen by others when caching their prizes, And if they are seen, they often return to the cache at a later time to move it somewhere else. In this way, it seems that they anticipate future theft or the possibility of future theft and act to ward it off. So at this point, I'd like to leave those experiments aside and take a more speculative step. Thinking with these experiments, I'd like to ask what this emerging understanding of corvids might demand of us. I think there are many different answers to this question, but I want to just explore one. And to do so, I need to introduce another corvid character from the other side of the world. These are the birds that first drew me into thinking about caching. They are the critically endangered aga or Mariana crow, found only on the tiny island of Rota in the Mariana Islands, where their numbers have plummeted over the past few decades. The cause of the decline of the aga on Rota, or the causes, are a bit unclear and likely include habitat loss, predation by introduced predators, perhaps a disease, as well as persecution by local Chamorro people who don't want these endangered birds on their land, or more specifically, don't want the conservation restrictions that often accompany the birds on their land. So when I went to Rota to talk to people about the aga, they told me many wonderful stories about these birds. One of the most fascinating things I learned was that these birds cache the nuts of the Pacific almond, and that as a result, some local people have taken to cutting down these almond trees on their land. There's a lot more that could be said about conservation politics, Indigenous sovereignty, and rights to land in this context, and I've written about those things elsewhere. I want to keep my focus more specific here on the crows and, in particular, their caching behaviour. So it was in an effort to better understand this behaviour of the aga that I turned to Clayton and the work in her lab on prospective cognition in jays. There have been no similar studies on the Mariana crow, and the conditions for such studies no longer exist. As such, we can have no definitive evidence that the similar caching behaviour of these two closely related species is grounded in similar capacities and understandings. However, as Nikki Clayton pointed out to me when I asked her about that possibility, the results of research on all of the corvid species from around the world that have been studied in this and other areas of cognition have been remarkably convergent. And so it's at least a reasonable proposition. So what would it mean for aga to be relating to their future in the way that these jays in the aviary in Cambridge seem to be relating to theirs? Let us accept for a moment then that corvid caching embodies a conscious relationship with the future, an imaginative engagement with what might be, and a deliberate mindful effort to bring about some possibilities and not others. Is it going too far to suggest that as an aga, Mariana crow, tucks an almond into a hole and covers it over, as she carefully checks for potential pilferers, she might enjoy a moment of hope? So in posing this question, I'm mindful of the dangers of collapsing all kinds of prospection into a single category that ignores important differences. Hope, after all, is a specific way of imagining and orienting oneself towards the future, albeit one that we seem to have a lot of difficulty precisely defining. But I'm equally concerned to avoid failing to appreciate similarities and connections between modes of prospection. I want to hold open room for the suggestion that we might be in the same general neighbourhood here, but these might be what Vincent Desprez would call versions of the same phenomena. At the very least, that playing around in this philosophical space, considering the possibility that this caching behaviour might be something like hope, might help us to see in interesting ways. So if our caching aga is able to imagine a future in which the almond is being stolen by another crow that she saw nearby at the time of caching, if she's motivated to return later to move the nut to a safer place, does it make sense to think that this behaviour is not grounded in the imagination of and desire for a particular future, one in which the almond will still be there when she returns? Can this behaviour really be understood in the absence of something like hopefulness, even if it's a very modest hope? In a world of uncertainty, a world in which food may well be scarce, caching is an effort to bring about the more desirable future in which one is not hungry. From this perspective, hope is anything but a uniquely human pastime. Perhaps caching crows help us to see that we inhabit a world of multiplying futures, a world thick with both possibilities and with crafty, desirous living beings working towards the fruition of particular futures. We simply don't know how many aspects of their lives crows apply this kind of prospective thinking to. As Clayton and colleagues have noted, what these caching experiments demonstrate is a capacity to think in this way. We should by no means assume that caching is the only area of their lives in which they imagine and work towards a future. In fact, recent research suggests that it is more likely to be a capacity that they can apply much more generally. So what else might the endangered crows of Rota hope for? Might they notice and even mourn their own dwindling numbers, the deaths of their own kin, the scarcity of a favourite food tree? As they do so, might they imagine an increasingly diminished future? In raising these admittedly very speculative questions, I want to take seriously the possibility that extinction might not be an unthinkable thought for all of those non-human species that face it. In their own ways, at least some individuals of some species may see and feel extinction coming. But more optimistically, in posing these questions, I want to make room for the possibility that these birds might, in their own corvid ways, also imagine other brighter days to come. In briefly drawing the Aga into this discussion, I hope you can get a sense of the kind of way in which I'm proposing to take up questions of meaning, value, and ethics, questions of earthly cohabitation, through a reflection on ethological research. There's no simple moral lesson to the fables that I'm exploring. Instead, they're openings into tentative, speculative, generative questioning about the worlds we share and craft with one another. As I've written about elsewhere, we need to be very careful about how we draw lessons for our conduct from animal examples. There are long histories of strategically and very selectively drawing on animal behaviours to argue in favour of the supposed naturalness of particular political, cultural, sexual, or other arrangements. But these arguments can be made to say almost anything. To select one overexploited instance, when it comes to political life, honeybees have long been a prized example, generally demonstrating the value of a well-ordered society ruled over by a benevolent monarch. But as the historian Julia Kint has noted, this is just one of the many ways in which these insects have been read, having been variously invoked over the centuries in support of feudalism, mercantilism, communism, fascism, the papacy, and more. And that's a shout out to Julia's new book, The Trojan Horse, which is fantastic and coming out very soon. So the lessons for human conduct drawn from fables like those of Aesop are generally a bit more benign, at least in my limited reading of them. And yet I do think it's worth resisting, or at least supplementing, any engagement with animals that's grounded in, one, anthropocentrism, where animals primarily function as a foil through which to think about human lives and dramas. Two, in stereotyping, where animals take stereotypical forms that reify specific characteristics and entrench, rather than questioning, assumptions about a given species, let alone looking for diversity within the species. And three, stories grounded in generalizing, where the lives of specific animals are thought to be able to offer general lessons for a variety of other kinds of organisms, living radically different lives in different ecological, historical, and cultural contexts. In short, my hope is that a speculative ethology might produce a different kind of fable that's grounded in a different relationship between the observation of animal lives and moral lessons for human life. This would be a relationship focused on the particular, on close attention to these creatures in this place, combined with some careful, tentative, generative extrapolation. In this time of extinctions, as so many species and so many diverse modes of life are slipping out of the world, to attend to others' ways of being is to enrich and deepen our sense of what's being lost. At the same time, learning more about others, not as caricatured morality tales, but as actual living beings, opens up avenues for imagining new modes of cohabitation. It's here, I think, that paying attention to how animals live might offer us the most important lessons about how we should live, not as models to be emulated or as the bases of simple morals, but as modes of life that, when carefully considered and appreciated on their own terms, allow us to ask of ourselves in ever more nuanced ways, what would it take for us to hold open or create room in the world for these others to endure and flourish? Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom. Wonderful. And to time, as always. So we've had 3 fantastic speakers, and we've got half an hour still, so we'll have plenty of time to open up to questions. But we thought that we would first just give the 3 speakers an opportunity to respond to each other or to ask each other questions, given that we have such an interesting panel assembled and so many interesting overlaps in terms of interest and expertise, as well as the types of questions that are being asked and the types of notions that are being used or put into question, whether around scientific versus public or folk knowledge, or whether around anthropomorphism or generalization and so on. So maybe we can leave it for Joe, Kaeli, or Tom, if anybody wants to go first. Joe.
Okay, I can. That's me.
Yes,
it's
Tom.
A question for both of you, I guess, Joe, with your ethology or comparative psychology hat on, and obviously Kaeli in the work you do. I guess I thought this explanation you were giving, Kaeli, was really interesting for the funeral type behaviour, and you pointed out really nicely that it's your question wasn't about emotional states and whether or not these birds are mourning. It was a different question about the possible functional advantages of learning. But then I noticed in the social media clip you showed, in the caption underneath it, it said that the study showed that these birds may not be mourning, that instead they were learning. And so there again, there was this slippage, which I think is so common in the press because it's very hard to accept 2 explanations at the same time for a behaviour. That what the study had shown is that they were learning, not mourning, rather than that they were learning and may also be mourning. So I guess I'm just wondering how as scientists and science communicators, how you navigate that, the desire to tell stories that have causal explanations of one sort, but that don't shut down interpretation, or that don't lend themselves to other people sloppily shutting down interpretation.
Yeah, nuance is a classically difficult thing to convey often in these short descriptions of incredibly complex, papers. I'm sure Joe can appreciate this, where I know with the study that I described just, here, there are so many components of it that never made it into any of the news articles. We compared how pigeons responded, we compared how crows responded to pigeons, and I find myself constantly compelled to condense it into the smallest, most digestible version. And it's a very difficult challenge to want to communicate these things in simplified ways without losing some of those details that are so crucial. And, specifically with respect to your question, it's one of the reasons that I really struggle with my use and continued use of the word funeral when I discuss my work, because you have to choose your words so carefully when it comes to science communication. You only get so many words. And that is one of the ways that I have tried to sort of leave that door open to this more emotionally loaded interpretation. Versus I could use the word that they used in the papers on scrub jays, which is cacophonous aggregation, to describe what we saw. But from my perspective, even though that would, realistically more effectively communicate the hard science of it and the specifics of what was being witnessed, at that point, you completely shut out any opportunity to, leave space for these other kinds of explanations. So, it is very difficult and something that I don't always do correctly, but I do think a lot about.
Yeah, I completely agree. Particularly when it comes to kind of media portrayals of experiments. What they want is a nice pithy headline that grabs attention, and most of the time that's going to be an animal doing something which draws parallels with human behavior. People want to have this inbuilt desire to know how animals relate to what we do and to see ourselves reflected in them. That's where you're coming from, Thom, I think, with saying be cautious about anthropocentrism when we're interpreting this. And that's where Danny Povinelli's coming from as well, with this term anthropomorphomania, that fables were never designed to be talking about animal behavior. They're moral messages which are designed to be about humans only, when animal characters were used because they grab attention and because they help to maybe digest these kinds of things. So there's definitely a tension. And for the Aesop's crow in the picture, you saw all of those headlines, and a lot of them alluded to crows being clever, the brainy crows solves this problem. And Nathan and Chris, in their original paper, they didn't jump to these kinds of conclusions. They were careful, and I think scientists generally pretty careful about jumping to these conclusions and using these kind of blanket statements about this shows that they have causal understanding of water displacement theory, or about the forces that are actually at play in these particular problems. But something gets lost quite frequently between that and public sort of communications. And I don't know that there's an easy solution for it, really. Like, I agree with you, Kaeli. It's never black and white, but I think humans have a tendency to want to think in black and white, and getting that extra nuance in is a challenge, and relies on good science communicators. But I think there are a lot of very good science communicators, but I think it's also about educating the public to maybe just take these headlines and things with a pinch of salt. Yeah. Kaeli, while you were talking about the crow funerals, I'm very familiar, obviously, with the work, but one of the things I haven't really thought about before is whether other species of corvid show this. I mean, given the sort of emotional and social lives of lots of the other species, I was thinking ravens must show similar. I couldn't bring to mind the kind of research, but what is known about the other species of corvid in this respect?
Yeah, so the answer to that is the reason you can't recall the research is there's very little. It's likely that I would say all of the birds in the Corvus genus display this behavior, and many of the other birds in the family. So there are anecdotes examining black-billed magpies, and there are a number of stories around black-billed magpies exhibiting a very similar aggregating behavior to what we see in crows. Likewise with ravens, there's one paper that looked at, in the United States, that looked at corvid effigies as a way to keep crows away from snowy plover nests, so as a way to manage around sensitive birds. And they found that it was kind of mixed results, but that's one of the best experiments on record, just demonstrating that ravens do care and that they alarm and avoid. So again, very similar to corvids. And then the original piece of work that really inspired my own was on California scrub jays, previously Western scrub jays. And they had a pretty similar experimental design. So looking at how they respond, but they compared more specifically their response to dead conspecifics, meaning dead jays, and a predator. And so that was one of the first foundational pieces that demonstrated that what it looks like to us is very similar. And so that's where this idea that they're using these dead birds as cues of danger, similar to how they might use a cue, a visual cue of actually seeing a predator, comes from. So then my work sort of spun off of that. But it's an unbelievably within reach area of study that is very underutilized, in my opinion. And I think we'll probably see a lot more studies coming out in the coming years, just sort of establishing these behaviors across the family.
Did Joe or Kaeli or Tom have anything further they wanted to add, or should I open it up to wider questions?
I don't have specific questions, just to say, Kaeli and Tom, I thought both of your talks were fantastic though. And I'm really glad that we managed to talk about such different aspects of, in a very kind of related and overlapping way. So yeah, no questions, but enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, likewise. And Tom, it was really nice. I don't know if you know that I'm on Tinian right now. So right next.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to contextualize that for everybody else, the Marianas are a very small island. The islands are very small, small island chain. And so Rota is our southern neighbor. We don't have Mariana crows, as Tom said, they're only found on Rota. So we don't have them here on Tinian, but it's a subject that I'm very invested in. And so it's, and not one that gets talked about a lot. And there are species very few people know about. So it's really delightful to be able to make that connection. And I remember seeing a talk very recently, my colleague, Henry Fandel, who works, until very recently was working on these birds. And he was describing his experiences of them being called the nothing birds, because people had such sort of some people have such low opinions and value of them. And so it was just really interesting to take that experience and be able to listen to the perspective that you had. And yeah, it was just a really wonderful event all around. Thank you, Carrie, for organizing it.
Okay, so I'll ask if any members of the audience want to ask a question, either by putting your hand up, which I hope I'll see somewhere, or unmuting yourself and using the force of your voice. Go ahead, Anna.
Hi, Matthew. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for your talks. It was very interesting. I have a question, actually, for Kaeli. I mean, I hope it's not too far off from your talk, but I was actually very interested in what you were discussing with the ravens, and all these different of studying some animal behavior, this anecdotal versus more systematic, and it resonated with me in this Aileen Christ research when she's discussing this internalistic versus externalistic approach to animal behavior in the natural sciences. But then Dominic Lestel and co-authors, Matthew is one of them, in 2014, they do talk about this by constructivist approach to animal behavior. And I was curious to know more about the methods that you use for your research for studying ravens.
Yeah, so to answer the first part of your question, one thing I probably didn't say explicitly enough in my talk was how valuable those kinds of anecdotal observations are to informing scientific research. And obviously, Joe described it in the context of fables as an aggregation of those anecdotes and the ways that they can become science. But sometimes it's just individual anecdotes. And it's one of the reasons that I think it is so important for scientists to maintain lines and communication with, with everybody else, because that's where a lot of our good ideas come from. So my work, I don't think I said this, but my work focused on American crows, not ravens. But the way that we had a couple of different studies, and the ways that we conducted it is we utilized breeding pairs, and we would start feeding them over the course of a couple of days to establish a baseline of how quickly they would access food. And then after 3 days, we would have our funeral event. We also tested a variety of other things. We looked at a person holding a crow. We looked at a person standing near a more familiar predator, which was a red-tailed hawk. We paired the red-tailed hawk with a crow, or we had nothing. Of course, we had a variety of controls. And then in the days that followed, we resumed feeding them to look for a difference in how quickly they would come down to the food. That's how we evaluated for their association with the place. And then in half the trials, the person came back every day for the next 3 days, only now without any kind of added danger, whether it was the dead crow or the hawk or whatever. And then they would also come every week. And then in the other half of the trials, they only came once a week. And we had volunteers wear masks, like you saw in that very terrifying picture. And the reason for that is because we know that crows, at least at first, mostly base their recognition of us on our face. They can add other characteristics over time, but the first thing that they really cue in on is the face. That just helped me control for the face, even though I was using a variety of volunteers. So that was kind of the broad strokes of how we did that study.
Did you want to follow up, Anna? Or
No, thank you so much.
Thank you for your question.
that whole question of the role of the animals themselves in the research, which I think was part of what Anna's referring to, I think is a really significant part of the whole debate. The Povinelli and Barker, who Joe mentioned, I'm not sure how much credence or how much we should be giving to the sort of strength of their refusal of a lot of the role of the fables in this research, or at least without balancing that sort of anti-anthropomorphism that they have with, as Anna mentioned, a sort of an anti-mechanomorphism or an anti-reductionism. And so I guess the question I'd have, which I'm not really asking, but just throwing out there for, is whether there's something sort of necessary about this sort of fable dimension, or the storytelling dimension in holding open the space for not just refusing human projection, but also refusing the very idea that only thing that can happen is we're caught up in this closed circle, this loop of human ideas, rather than there being other agents that are involved in telling us something about what's going on here. But unless somebody wants to respond to my ramble, there is also a question in the chat, which is a third method that I forgot to mention, from Anna Shockley, who asks Kaeli whether you know of any research, similar research being done with domestic birds. And Anna mentioned living with guinea fowl, who she's seen pay attention to dead or dying members of the group.
I don't know of any formal research that's been done. There are individual like short communications papers that have reported on chickens and both wild and domestic ducks. But that would be a really interesting question. I mean, the only kind of a middle ground, but like I mentioned before, so we looked at pigeons. And if you don't know the history of pigeons, pigeons are basically just feral pets. Today's rock pigeon has a long domestication history. And so they're kind of an interesting one, whether when we think about pigeon behavior, whether we're going to contextualize it as a wild animal the way that we do crows, or as this sort of interesting gray area third party. But the work that we did on pigeons revealed that they were very unresponsive to dead conspecifics in a way that very starkly contrasted what crows did. But what I've heard about ducks and chickens is that they sometimes have very dramatic responses. So I think it's a really interesting area of research that deserves more attention.
Can I just jump in. Sorry, Matt. I think I'm responding to what you were asking or opening up a moment ago. I thought it was really productive in your talk, Joe, the example you used to respond to, I'm now forgetting Nelly, to respond to that accusation that this the problem with looking at fables by breaking down any kind of sharp distinction between science and fable. And I think that's so much more productive as an avenue to go down, rather than insisting that the crow picture story is actually originally science and then it becomes a fable, and then just to use that as an example to blur the idea that there is any fundamental distinction between science and fables. Fables are ways of sharing observations, more or less reliably, but different kinds of scientific observations have always been more or less reliable. So I guess I think it's a really productive question for us to keep coming back to, and I think one of the things we need to do in order to do that well, and especially to do it across disciplines, across the humanities and social sciences and the natural sciences, is to be using similar language. I guess some of the terms that jump out, that like around objectivity, which is a term that most folks in the humanities and social sciences just immediately sort of flinch at objectivity, but obviously it's not a term that is as problematic for many folks in the natural sciences. I think we would prefer to talk about something being a disinterested observation, maybe, but to acknowledge that even if you're not using a fable to structure your research, you're using all sorts of other assumptions built into the way that vision, the priority of vision in the way that we structure the mirror self-recognition test, for example. All of our tests of animal cognition have all sorts of assumptions, cultural or biophysical or whatever they are, built into them. And so slowing down with and trying to excavate those assumptions rather than saying, this is an objective experimental framework and this is one that is based on a childish fable, that's a distinction that's never going to get us anywhere. And that's slowing down more with the assumptions built into all of our scientific frameworks is, I guess, the work that a lot of us in the humanities who try to engage with the sciences are doing. So I don't know what my question is there, except that I thought that your tracing of the fable back to something scientific is really productive and opens that up, but also opens up this question of what language we all use. And I was triggered to this, by this question of anecdote, which is another term that I think we often use in different ways, although again really appreciated the way you, Kaeli, flagged that you're not using anecdote as a pejorative term because it is so often used as a negative. So that was another ramble. Sorry, Matt, I responded to your ramble with a ramble.
And as you were talking, I was finding myself thinking, I've got loads of responses to this. I've probably forgotten them all now. But I completely agree. And I don't want to give the impression through my talk that I think that science has to be like that. Just that, that there has been this reaction, and it's an extreme reaction from folks that have, tended to be trained on a very strict kind of comparative psychology to really react strongly against any idea of using something that's not objective science to structure that kind of research. But like you say, we're shaped by being human in every way that we think about science, and there's no way of getting rid of that in the way that we study things. Like I've heard of some psychologists who just don't want to even see. I mean, they want to be so detached from the experiments that they don't get any preconceptions that might bias their interpretation of the results in a way, which is really quite an extreme sort of way to be thinking about it, because we cannot stand back and detach ourselves from the way that we think about other animals. It's just impossible. we're always going to bring our biases and our preconceptions and our ways of thinking, because we can't step out into the mind of a crow. We can't do it. So yeah, I'm kind of rambling back. I don't know of any
It's my
questions
fault, it's
either.
contagious, I'm sorry.
But just to say that I agree.
Yeah, I mean, for my part, I appreciated, Joe, I thought you were incredibly gracious when you were describing the antagonism towards the use of fables, and the way that we should hold space for that, because I do not have that grace. I think it's complete hogwash. I think it's representative of some of the most nefarious components of science, where those are the same communities of people who have routinely, and I think to the great detriment of science and science communicators, asked us to completely divorce ourselves from what it is to be a person and from culture. And the consequence of that is you see these scientists making these interpretations, particularly, and I'll just use this as an example, as it, say, relates to the roles of sex and gender. And they'll make these, what we now can appreciate are wild interpretations based on very classic perceptions of gender roles, thinking that they've done so with this incredible level of objectivity, because they would never, they don't leave themselves space to understand their own work and their own ideas in these broader, cultural contexts. And so then because of that, we see these really inappropriate interpretations of animal behavior based on Western cultural ideas about gender roles. And so I have a much harder time with folks that are just try so hard for that divorce between, science and non-science, because, I think that it often does more harm than good.
Yeah, fair enough. I think it can be useful to almost have like a little tug of war, in that there will be some people who potentially might need just nudging back, in the sense of not jumping to these kinds of conclusions without any sort of scientific basis. But yeah, I thought it was an interesting perspective to add in. It's not. It should be acknowledged. It's probably not the mainstream, and as you can see from all of the research that is being done, science has progressed using the Aesop's fable, very much so. So
yeah,
And
absolutely.
I was just going to mention, following on from what Kaeli was saying, and given that Anna Paula mentioned Eileen Christ's work earlier, that I think one of her former students, Erica Malam's work in the history of science, is really great on tracing some of the ways in which sort of particular, assumptions and ideas around gender and race were projected onto or used in the interpretation of animal behavior in all sorts of ways that are as you described, pretty unscientific. But we have two more questions lined up, and we are running out of time a little bit. So I will ask if Angelique wants to unmute.
Hi. So this is sort of a question, but also a bit of a ramble as well. I could listen to this all day. I really, really enjoyed the talk. I've got a bit of a sore throat, sorry. But my question, I guess, is around the nature of crows and the kind of vitriol that people have for them. So as a corvid fan, I'm always a big supporter of them. But when I worked in a pet shop for a long time, you'd see people buying tons and tons of like seed for wild birds, but they would gleefully tell me how they would shoot crows or magpies or actively do things to harm them. And the justification of this was that the crows and magpies and all that kind of stuff, they eat the eggs from the nest of other birds. And what I find so fascinating about this is I'm sure like there's probably lots of data on it, but humans are probably a bigger risk for those birds and their eggs, of the kind of the smaller, cuter birds that we all like in the British countryside, than like actual crows and magpies. And I was wondering if anyone had any kind of details around that, or the kind of this idea of somehow the way we portray crows and magpies and things as being far more like dangerous to other birds than is actually the real kind of objective truth about them. And also, I just wanted to add that when it comes to science and storytelling, I think a really important thing to note is as well, like indigenous cultures and the kind of knowledge practices and the way they were shared through storytelling. And I think it's taken Western culture a long time to appreciate the role of things like folklore and sort of traditional kind of practices and the scientific value in them. Yeah, that was what I had to say.
I'm happy to. Oh, yeah, no,
go ahead.
Okay. I was just going to jump in then on the first point about the ways that crows and magpies are portrayed. But Kaeli, I'm sure you were going to say the same, and this relates back to your talk anyway. That these are birds that have long been associated with death, and that's really shaped the public ideas about them. So I think people are generally surprised when they hear that the corvids are actually belong to the same songbird family. They view them as something different from, as you said, these like cuddly little garden birds that visit. And of course, they are omnivorous. They will eat eggs. They will eat nestlings. They're a great source of food if they can access them. But where I think we have a problem is where people start to ascribe intentionality or malicious intent on the part of these birds, and that's something that we tend to do quite easily for members of the corvid family. I think we sort of associate them as being these kind of evil birds, when actually all they're doing is finding food and capitalizing on opportunities that are afforded to them. They are a problem in terms of, like, if you think about conservation, and especially things like ground nesting birds and some other species, then corvids are a problem, and a conservationist will probably not be as well inclined towards them, because they are trying, their goal is to get eggs and to get chicks of these endangered species, and ravens and crows and magpies are not helpful in that respect. But most of this comes down to the fact that humans have altered the planet and have altered the environment, and lots of natural processes are way out of kilter, and things like crows and ravens and other corvids have done very well out of this, and their numbers have potentially increased to the point where they are more of a problem for predation and things like that. But this comes down to us and the way that we've managed the lands and the way that we've given them those opportunities, I guess. Kaeli, let me hand over to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add, there was a review paper that came out in 2018 that looked at the role of various generalist predators, including crows, as limiting factors for various demographics of birds, including songbirds, ground nesting birds, seabirds. And they found very little evidence that there was a strong correlation between the increasing densities of corvids in the English countryside and other places and declining songbirds. So there are exceptions to that. The snowy plovers that I mentioned are a good one. Sage grouse can be another one in the United States, but by and large, predator removal studies around the world have showed a surprising lack of connection between corvid abundance and songbird declines.
Great, thanks both of you. So we are at the hour, but we still have another couple of minutes if people could stick around. There was a question from Kaeli in the chat to Joe, asking whether the framework of Aesop's Fables is still being utilised, and why it might have proved to be so popular, and also what kind of intelligence this kind of experiment tries to measure. So if there's any of those threads that you want to pick up on?
Okay. Framework of Aesop's Fables still being utilised, well, in the sense of it being a continuation of the original fable for the crow and the pitcher. Yes, that's very much still being utilised in scientific research. But like I said in my talk, it's been modified and improved upon, and the experiments that are done today will probably be termed in line with the Aesop's fable test, but they've kind of been tweaked because to be better able to kind of address the kinds of questions that researchers are asking about their particular species. In terms of why it's proved to be so popular, I guess this was a very simple, like beautifully simple experimental design, which allowed researchers to ask questions about particular cognitive abilities. And that sort of overlaps with what Thom presented, in that food caching is a behavior, natural behavior, which happens to have the potential to be very revealing about the cognitive processes that underlie food caching, whether that's memory or prospective, prospection. So I think this very simple test kind of was used as a way of tapping into birds' understanding of the physical forces at play, although that's kind of the danger zone. That's kind of where researchers have to be quite careful in terms of like what are they actually asking, and that's where we also have to be careful about how the media pick it up and what they talk about, because from that test alone it's impossible to say that an animal, the rooks, are intelligent. We can't really say that, and once you get into looking at the study in more detail, you have to start looking at what prior experience did those birds have, what pre-training might they have had, which might well have shaped their behavior in that particular test. The Aesop's crow is a single moment, it's a single kind of snapshot of the life of a crow, and potentially it was grounded in fact, in that these people potentially observed crows doing these kinds of things, but that alone is never enough to say that the birds are intelligent or that they understand that dropping a rock will displace the water by this amount. They could have done it 100 times before. They could have watched another bird doing it. They could have accidentally seen a stone fall into water, or they could simply be responding to the movement of the water coming closer to them, or the little worm sitting at the top of the surface. If I do this behavior and the stone goes in, it comes a bit closer to me. That's not the same as saying that they've got any understanding of water displacement or causation in that respect. So it kind of, that single test I think has been very popular because, like I said, it's very simple, but it's opened doors to a lot of different theoretical questions and things that can be studied around the birds and now mammals and other animals' physical cognition. Hopefully that answered your question.
Well, I'm satisfied. Unless Thom or Kaeli wanted to add anything further, I think I might wrap it up, given that we are a little bit over time. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to all three speakers for such fantastic talks and engagement.